The Horn of Africa has always been a land of courage and contradiction, where ancient kingdoms and modern nations collide. Yet few stories have been as misunderstood, as deeply scarred, and as politically charged as the one between Eritrea and Ethiopia, two neighbors bound by history, faith, and blood, yet divided by war. What began as a shared struggle for liberation turned into one of Africa's deadliest border conflicts, costing tens of thousands of lives. Behind every battle, every speech, and every silence lies a deeper truth of pride, betrayal, and the haunting question, how did two brothers become enemies? This is the true story behind Eritrea's war with Ethiopia. When the dust of colonial rule settled over Africa, the Horn of Africa became one of its most complex frontiers. Eritrea, a small but defiant nation on the Red Sea coast, had endured decades of foreign control, first by Italy, then by Britain, and finally, controversially, by Ethiopia. In the years after World War II, while most of Africa marched toward independence, Eritrea's fate was decided not by its people but by geopolitics. The newly formed United Nations, under the influence of Cold War powers, voted to federate Eritrea with Ethiopia in 1952. It was a move that seemed diplomatic at the time, but one that would set the stage for decades of resentment. For Ethiopia, ruled by Emperor Haile Selassie, it was a chance to reclaim what was once considered part of the ancient Abyssinian kingdom. For Eritreans, it was a betrayal of the promise of self-determination. By 1962, the federation was dissolved by Selassie and Eritrea was formally annexed. Overnight, the Eritrean flag was banned, its language suppressed, and its autonomy erased. What followed was not peace, but rebellion. In the barren hills and mountains of Sahel, young Eritreans, students, farmers, and exiles took up arms. The Eritrean Liberation Front, ELF, became the first organized resistance, but soon fragmented into factions. Out of this chaos emerged the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, the EPLF led by a soft-spoken yet fiercely strategic man, Isaias Afwerki, under Afwerki's leadership. The EPLF became one of the most disciplined and effective guerrilla movements in modern history. They built underground hospitals, schools, and even factories in caves, sustaining a population under siege. It was a war not only for independence, but for dignity, waged with unmatched endurance against Ethiopia's far superior military. Yet, in a paradox of African politics, many of the fighters on both sides shared the same roots. Ethiopia's own revolution was brewing. As the Derg, a Marxist military junta, overthrew the emperor in 1974, the Derg, led by Mengistu Haile Mariam, soon found itself fighting not only Eritrean rebels in the north, but Tigrayan rebels in the south, the TPLF, or Tigray People's Liberation Front for nearly 2 decades. This brutal three-way war consumed the Horn of Africa. Soviet arms poured into Ethiopia, while Eritreans and Tigrayans relied on sheer willpower and external diaspora support. By 1991, the Derg collapsed. The TPLF and EPLF, once allies in revolution, marched side by side into Addis Ababa for the first time in modern history. Ethiopia was under the leadership of those who had fought from the margins. Eritrea, meanwhile, declared its independence, with Isaias Afwerki becoming its first president. For a brief moment, there was hope that these former comrades could rebuild the region through cooperation and mutual respect. Ethiopia, under Zenawi, and Eritrea, under Afwerki, represented a new generation of African leaders who had come from the battlefield. Not the ballot box, but peace was fragile. Old wounds were hidden beneath new promises. Economic friction began to surface almost immediately. The two nations had once shared currency, trade routes, and cultural ties. Now, Eritrea wanted full sovereignty over its ports and finances. Ethiopia, landlocked and dependent on Eritrean ports for trade, grew uneasy. The breaking point came in 1998, a small, dusty border town called Badme. It began as a local skirmish, but within weeks it exploded into full-scale war. Tanks rolled, artillery thundered, and trenches filled with soldiers on both sides, many of whom had once fought together for freedom. The war between Eritrea and Ethiopia from 1998 to 2000 was catastrophic. Over 80,000 lives were lost. Civilians were displaced, towns flattened, and families divided by arbitrary lines on a map. Each side accused the other of aggression, but behind the headlines, this was more than a border war. It was a war of identity. For Eritrea, it was about defending hard-won independence. For Ethiopia, it was about sovereignty and national pride. When the guns finally fell silent in 2000, the Algiers Agreement was signed. The two nations agreed to international arbitration to determine the rightful ownership of Badme. The decision, when it came, was clear: Badme belonged to Eritrea. Yet Ethiopia refused to withdraw its troops, and the stalemate dragged on for nearly 2 decades. In those years, Eritrea became increasingly isolated. Sanctions were imposed. Journalists were silenced. The once heroic image of Afwerki transformed into that of an authoritarian ruler. Meanwhile, Ethiopia under Haile Zenawi pursued economic reform and international partnerships. Though not without internal dissent and repression, the Horn of Africa, once united by liberation movements, now stood divided by suspicion. Eritrea accused Ethiopia of neo-colonial arrogance. Ethiopia accused Eritrea of sponsoring instability in the region. Yet even in this cold peace, the people of both nations longed for something else: reconciliation. That moment arrived unexpectedly. In 2018, Ethiopia's new Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, made a bold move. He announced Ethiopia's acceptance of the border ruling, nearly 2 decades late, and extended a hand of peace to Eritrea. In a moment broadcast to the world, Abiy Ahmed and Isaias Afwerki embraced in Asmara, bringing an emotional end to 20 years of hostility. Streets filled with cheering crowds, families reunited, and flights between Addis Ababa and Asmara resumed after decades. It was hailed as a new dawn. Abiy would go on to win the Nobel Peace Prize in 2019, but as history often reminds us, peace in the Horn of Africa is rarely simple. Beneath the surface of celebration, regional dynamics were shifting again. The TPLF, the former ruling elite in Ethiopia, had lost power under Abiy. Tensions between Addis Ababa and Tigray escalated, culminating in a devastating civil conflict in 2020. Eritrea, once the enemy of Ethiopia, was now accused of intervening militarily alongside Ethiopian federal forces against the TPLF. Their old wartime allies, for many observers. It was the ultimate twist of irony, the same actors now recast in reversed roles. Repeating history's tragic rhythm, the story of Eritrea and Ethiopia is not one of simple villains or heroes. It is a reflection of Africa's postcolonial struggle, a struggle between unity and identity, sovereignty and survival. It is the story of two nations who once dreamed together, bled together, and then tore each other apart in pursuit of pride. Today, Eritrea remains one of the most secretive nations in the world, often described as the North Korea of Africa, with mandatory national service and strict state control. Ethiopia, on the other hand, faces its own internal divisions, ethnic conflicts, political rivalries, and economic strains, but across both borders, ordinary people continue to live, work, and hope. They remember the days when music and trade crossed freely between Asmara and Addis. They remember shared laughter, shared culture, shared loss. And perhaps in that shared memory lies the seed of a future peace, one that no agreement can enforce, but that hearts can choose to build, because in the end, Eritrea and Ethiopia are bound by more than borders. They are bound by history, a history written in pain, endurance, and the unbreakable will of a people who refuse to be defined by war alone. And maybe one day, when the mountains no longer echo with gunfire, and the Red Sea winds carry songs instead of sorrow, the world will finally understand that the true story behind Eritrea's war with Ethiopia was never about land. It was about freedom, dignity, and the dream of standing equal in a world that never believed they could.